Hold your line, sectors, stay tight.
October 14th, 1943.
We follow this route
Oh,
exactly.
430 hours.
The attack commences at
Thorpe
first
Abbotts
light.
Airfield,
Any
England.
deviation will
Michael
compromise the
Romano
mission.
stood in the dark outside the briefing hut, his breath visible in the cold
Your
air.
objective is here, gentlemen.
22 years
The
old.
attack must be swift
5
and
missions
decisive.
survived.
Any questions?
0 confirmed kills. His hands didn't shake anymore that had stopped after the second mission, when he realized fear was just another thing you carried like your parachute or your dog tags. Romano. Inside now. Lieutenant Carlson's voice cut through the pre-dawn darkness. Romano crushed his cigarette under his boot and pushed through the
Hold
door.
it steady there. We're almost done with this
80
scene.
men packed onto
Copy
wooden
that.
benches, their faces gray in the dim light.
Looks good. from
Everyone
here.
stared at the covered map at the front of the room. Colonel Stanley Ray stood beside it, his jaw tight. Romano had learned to read that expression. Tight jaw meant deep penetration.
Hold your line, sectors, stay
Tight jaw meant no fighter escort. Tight jaw meant some of them wouldn't be coming back. Ray yanked the curtain down. The red string stretched across the map from England through Holland, deep into Germany. It ended at a city circled in blood-red ink, Schweinfurt. Jesus Christ, someone whispered behind Romano. Ball-bearing factories. Ray said, his voice flat and hard. You knock them out, the entire German war machine stops. Every tank, every plane, every weapon they're building needs these bearings. Intelligence says this is the target that wins the war. Intelligence said that about Bremen too, a pilot muttered. We lost 12 planes over Bremen. Ray ignored him. Time over target is 1,400 hours. Altitude 25,000 feet. Expected resistance. He paused, and in that pause, Romano felt his stomach drop. Expected resistance is maximum effort from Luftwaffe fighter groups. FW-190s and Bf-109s from multiple airfields. Our P-47 escort will turn back at the German border. You'll be alone for 90 minutes over hostile territory. 90 minutes. Romano's fingers went cold. 90 minutes meant every German pilot between here and Schweinfurt would be climbing to meet them. 90 minutes meant the sky would be full of tracers and cannon fire and burning B-17s falling out of formation like wounded birds. Weather forecast shows 10/10 cloud cover until you reach the target, then it clears. Ray looked across the assembled crews, his expression harder now, almost angry. I'm not going to tell you this is going to be easy. It won't be. But it's necessary. Dismissed. The room erupted in conversation as crews stood and filed toward the door. Romano didn't move. He stared at the map at that red circle around Schweinfurt and thought about his tail gun position, a plexiglass bubble barely big enough to crouch in, with a gun sight that hadn't been updated since 1940. He thought about the German fighters that would come at him from behind, moving at closing speeds of 500 miles per hour. He thought about how many rounds he'd fired on the last 5 missions, probably 3,000, and how many enemy aircraft he'd hit. 0, not 1. Frank Kellerman stood beside him, a grease-stained rag in his hands. You coming? Tell me something, Frank. How many tail gunners have we lost? Kellerman's expression didn't change. Don't do this to yourself. How many? 7, in 11 weeks. And how many German fighters have tail gunners across the entire group shot down in that same time? Kellerman looked away. Maybe 10, maybe 15. So we're dying at a rate of 7 to 15. We're losing. Romano stood up, his voice low and urgent. We're flying into Germany with World War I technology and hoping for miracles. That gun sight in my turret, you know what it is. It's a ring and a bead. That's it. No lead computing, no ranging. I'm supposed to track a fighter doing 400 miles an hour, and guess where he'll be by the time my bullets reach him? It's insane. The Army thinks it works. The Army's not sitting in the tail watching fighters blow past, while I put tracers into empty air. Romano's voice was rising now, and he forced it back down. Yesterday over Bremen, I had a perfect shot. 109 coming straight at me, maybe 300 yards out. I tracked him exactly like the manual says, led him 3 aircraft lengths, squeezed the trigger. 60 rounds, Frank. 60 rounds, and I didn't touch him. He put a burst through our horizontal stabilizer and disappeared. We could have died, because I can't see where my bullets are actually going. Kellerman pulled Romano toward the door, away from the other crews. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten, a thin gray line on the eastern horizon. B-17s sat in rows along the taxiway, their propellers still their gun barrels, pointing at nothing. "What are you thinking?" Kellerman asked quietly. Romano pulled a folded paper from inside his jacket. His hands were steady now, focused. 3 nights ago, I was doing pre-flight checks in the tail turret. Had my flashlight on checking the ammunition feeds. The beam reflected off the plexiglass canopy, and I saw something. I saw the ghost of my tracer paths from the previous mission burned into my vision, but reflected in the curved glass. And I thought, what if that's not an accident? What if we use mirrors to give me a real-time view of my own bullet stream? He unfolded the paper. It was covered in sketches, angles, measurements, sight lines drawn with a carpenter's pencil. 3 small mirrors mounted inside the turret at specific angles. They catch the tracer light and redirect it into my peripheral vision. I keep my eyes on the target through the main sight, but I see my rounds in the mirrors. I can adjust mid-burst. I can actually see if I'm behind or ahead of the target instead of guessing. Kellerman took the paper, his eyes moving over the drawings. His expression was unreadable, but Romano knew that look. That was Kellerman's machinist face, the expression he got when he was working through a mechanical problem in his head, testing tolerances and stress points and failure modes. "The angles would need to be precise," Kellerman said finally. "A 1/4 degree off and you're just looking at reflections of nothing. And where are you getting mirrors? We don't have optical glass." "Gun sights from crashed P-47s. The reflector assemblies, they're just mirrors with crosshairs etched on them. We pull the mirrors out, cut them to size, remount them. There's 3 P-47s in the salvage yard right now, with busted landing gear but intact gun sights. Nobody's tracking individual components from crashed fighters. That's theft of military property. That's saving lives." Romano's voice was hard, now urgent. "How many more tail gunners die before someone admits the current system doesn't work? How many?" A jeep rolled past carrying officers toward the operations building. Both men fell silent until it disappeared around a hangar. The eastern sky was brighter now, turning from gray to pale blue. Somewhere across the field, engines were starting up the deep rumble of Wright cyclones coming to life. "Even if I wanted to help," Kellerman said carefully, "we'd need time. Your wheel's up in 3 hours. Not for today. We install it tonight after debrief. Tomorrow's mission is supposed to be a milk run coastal patrol light resistance. We test it then. If it works, we show the brass. If it doesn't work..." Romano stopped, then shrugged. "If it doesn't work, at least I tried to fix the problem instead of just dying with it." Kellerman looked at the B-17s lined up along the taxiway, their olive drab paint dark against the lightening sky. He looked at Romano, this kid from Pittsburgh, who'd dropped out of high school at 16 to work in a steel mill, who'd enlisted because he thought it was better than spending his life in a factory, who now sat in the worst position on the worst bomber in the European theater and couldn't hit anything. "Tonight," Kellerman said, "after debrief, bring your sketch and be ready to work fast. I'll get the mirrors." "Thank you." "Don't thank me. If this goes wrong, we're both looking at court-martial." Kellerman handed the paper back. "Now get to your plane. You've got a war to survive first." Romano jogged across the tarmac toward Knockout Dropper, the B-17 he'd been assigned to for 6 missions. The crew was already gathering at the hardstand pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, radio operator, 2 waist gunners, ball turret gunner, and Romano. 10 men who would spend the next 8 hours inside a metal tube while the Luftwaffe tried to kill them. Lieutenant Bob Pierce, the pilot, was doing his walk-around inspection. He was 24 but looked 40, his face drawn and his eyes red-rimmed from too many missions and not enough sleep. "Romano, you're late." "Sorry, sir. Won't happen again." "It better not. I need you awake and sharp today. Intelligence says the 109s are going to hit us from the rear because they know that's where we're weakest. Pierce looked directly at Romano, and there was something in his eyes, not accusation, but a kind of desperate hope. I need you to keep them off us. Can you do that? Romano wanted to say no. He wanted to say that his gun sight was obsolete, that his training was inadequate, that he'd fired thousands of rounds without hitting anything, and today probably wouldn't be different. Instead, he said, "Yes, sir, I'll keep them off." Pierce nodded and moved on to check the landing gear. Romano climbed through the rear hatch and squeezed into his position. The tailgun station was a plexiglass bubble, barely 5 feet across. He knelt on a padded board with his back pressed against the rear bulkhead, the twin 50 caliber machine guns dominating his entire field of view. Between the guns was the gun sight, a ring of metal with a single post in the center, crude and simple and useless. He'd spend today staring through that ring while German fighters came at him at 500 miles per hour, and he'd squeeze the trigger and watch his tracers arc through empty space, always behind, always too late. Tailgun check-in. Pierce's voice crackled through the intercom. Tailgun checked and ready. Roger. Starting engines in 2 minutes. Romano tested the turret controls. The hydraulics responded smoothly, rotating the guns left and right, elevating and depressing them through their full range of motion. He checked his ammunition, 550 rounds per gun, loaded in metal boxes that fed through canvas chutes. Everything worked exactly as designed. That was the problem. It worked exactly as designed in 1940, when the Army thought strategic bombing would be conducted in clear weather at medium altitude against light opposition. Nobody had planned for this, for mass formations at 25,000 feet, for temperature 40 below zero, for Luftwaffe fighters, attacking in waves of 30 or 40 aircraft at a time. The engines started. Number 3, first, then 4, then 1, and 2. The entire airframe shuddered with barely contained power. Through his tiny window, Romano watched other B-17s starting their engines up and down the line, a choreographed sequence of propellers spinning to life, exhaust smoke billowing in the morning air. 291 bombers would take off this morning. By tonight, some of those hardstands would be empty, their crews scattered across Germany in pieces too small to identify. Romano pulled his oxygen mask on and plugged into the system. The rubber smelled like sweat and fear, and the breath of every gunner who'd worn it before him. Some of those men were dead now. Jenkins had died over Bremen, his turret blown apart by 20mm cannon fire. Miller had burned alive over Wilhelmshaven when his oxygen system caught fire. Romano had known their names, their hometowns, their girlfriends' names. Now he couldn't remember their faces. That was how you survived. You forgot the dead so you could focus on staying alive. All stations prepare for taxi. Pierce's voice was calm, professional. He'd been a crop duster in Iowa before the war, used to flying low and slow over cornfields. Now, he flew a 4-engine bomber into the teeth of the German air defense system and pretended it was normal. Knockout Dropper lurched forward, the tail wheel bumping over the tarmac as Pierce steered toward the runway. Through his window, Romano watched the other bombers falling into line, a long chain of olive-drab metal stretching across the airfield. Each one carried 10 men. Each one carried 5,000 pounds of bombs. Each one was a target. The bomber ahead of them reached the runway and roared down the concrete, picking up speed, the tail lifting, then the whole aircraft rotating into the air. Their turn. Pierce locked the brakes and ran the engines up to full power. The noise was overwhelming even through Romano's helmet. 4 200 horsepower engines screaming at maximum RPM, the propellers clawing at the air. The brakes released. The B-17 surged forward, accelerating down the runway. Romano felt the tail lift as airspeed increased. Then the bumping stopped, and they were airborne, climbing into the gray English morning. The formation took 20 minutes to assemble 291 bombers stacking up in combat boxes of 18 aircraft each. The boxes arranged in a defensive formation, designed to maximize overlapping fields of fire from the gunners. Romano watched them through his window, a sky full of B-17s, turning in lazy circles as they climbed to altitude, and he thought about what would happen in a few hours when German fighters tore into this formation and tried to break it apart. "Tail gun, how's your visibility?" Pierce asked over the intercom. "Good visibility, sir. Clear all the way back." "Stay sharp. Intelligence says they'll hit us over the border." The bombers climbed through 10,000 feet, then 15,000. The air grew thin and cold. Romano's breath came harder now, each inhalation pulling against the resistance of the oxygen mask. At 20,000 feet, ice began forming on the plexiglass, tiny crystals spreading across his field of view. He scraped them away with his gloved hand, but they formed again almost immediately. At 25,000 feet, the temperature inside his turret was 40 below zero. His fingers were numb inside his heated gloves. His toes had no feeling at all. The formation crossed the English coast at 08:10 hours, a sky full of bombers heading east toward Germany. Below them, the channel was gray and endless, its surface broken by whitecaps. Romano had read somewhere that if you went down in the channel in October, you had maybe 15 minutes before hypothermia killed you. 15 minutes to be rescued or 15 minutes to die. Most men died. "Enemy coast ahead," the navigator announced. "ETA to German border, 30 minutes. Romano checked his guns one more time, charging them and feeling the bolts slam forward. The ammunition belts were loaded with a mix of armor-piercing incendiary and tracer rounds, one tracer for every 5 rounds, so you could see where your bullets were going. Except you couldn't, not really. By the time you saw the tracers, the target had already moved. You were always shooting at where the enemy had been, not where he was. That was the fundamental problem, the thing that made tail gunners ineffective and kept getting them killed. Tonight, Romano thought. Tonight we fix it, if he survived today. The formation crossed into German airspace at 0920 hours. The P-47 escort waggled their wings and turned back toward England, their fuel tanks already running low. 291 B-17s continued east alone and exposed. Romano scanned the sky behind them, looking for the small dark specks that would mean fighters climbing to intercept. The sky was empty. That wouldn't last. "Bandits, 6 o'clock high." The call came from the ball turret gunner, his voice tight with adrenaline. "Multiple contacts, looks like a whole squadron." Romano rotated his turret and looked up. There, dark specks against the pale sky, maybe 30 of them climbing fast. BF-109s. They'd hit from above and behind, diving through the formation at 400 miles per hour, firing their 20mm cannons and machine guns, then pulling away before the bomber gunners could track them. "Here they come!" someone yelled. The first fighter dove his wings, suddenly bright with muzzle flashes. Romano tracked him through his gun sight, led him 3 aircraft lengths, like the manual said, and squeezed his triggers. The .50 calibers hammered tracers, arcing out into space. The fighter flashed past untouched, and Romano's rounds disappeared into empty air. Too far behind. Always too far behind. Another fighter. Romano swung his turret, tracked fired. Miss. Another. Track fire miss. His turret filled with the smell of cordite and hot metal. Spent shell casings bounced off the plexiglass. Tracers from other bombers crisscrossed the sky, a web of fire that looked impressive and hit nothing. A B-17 200 yards to their right suddenly exploded, its bomb load detonating in a massive fireball. Romano saw tiny black shapes falling from the wreckage, men without parachutes tumbling through 25,000 feet of empty air. 10 seconds to fall. 10 seconds to think about it. "Stay in formation." Pierce's voice was strained. "Don't break formation." More fighters. They came in waves now, 20 or 30 at a time, their cannons tearing into the bomber stream. Romano fired until his barrels glowed red, until his ammunition boxes were half empty, until his shoulders ached from the recoil. He didn't hit anything. Around him, other B-17s were falling, some spinning, some burning, some simply breaking apart in midair. He counted 7, then 9, then stopped counting because what was the point? The target was still 40 minutes away. They'd never make it. But they did. Somehow, they made it to Schweinfurt, dropped their bombs through heavy flak that turned the sky black with explosions, and turned for home. The fighters came again on the way back, attacking in relays, and Romano fired and missed and fired and missed until his ammunition was gone, and all he could do was kneel in his turret and watch German fighters tear his formation apart. They landed at Thorpe Abbotts at 1640 hours. 60 B-17s didn't come back. 600 men were dead or missing. Romano climbed out of his turret, his legs shaking, his hands cramping from 8 hours of gripping the gun controls. His ears rang from the noise. His face was frostbitten where the oxygen mask hadn't sealed properly. Kellerman was waiting at the hardstand. He looked at Romano and didn't say anything. He didn't need to. "Tonight," Romano said. His voice was hoarse. "We build it tonight." Kellerman nodded. "I already got the mirrors." The debriefing took 2 hours. Romano sat in a folding chair in the operations hut. Smoke thick in the air, officers asking the same questions over and over. "How many fighters did you see? Where did they attack from? Did you observe any new tactics?" He answered mechanically, his mind elsewhere. 60 bombers gone, 600 men. And what did the tail gunners accomplish? Maybe 15 confirmed kills across the entire mission. 15. They were dying at a rate of 40 to 1, and the army kept sending them up with equipment that didn't work. "Sergeant Romano." An intelligence officer stood in front of him, clipboard in hand. "Did you fire your weapons today?" "Yes, sir." "Approximate number of rounds expended?" 900, maybe 1,000. "Any confirmed hits?" Romano looked up at him. The officer was maybe 25, fresh-faced, probably straight from college. He'd never sat in a tail turret watching fighters come at him at 500 miles per hour. "No, sir. No confirmed hits." The officer made a note on his clipboard and moved on to the next gunner. Romano stood up, his legs unsteady, and walked out into the night. It was 1900 hours. Full dark. The temperature had dropped to near freezing, and his breath fogged in the air. Across the tarmac, he could see the maintenance crews working on damaged bombers under floodlights, patching holes, replacing hydraulic lines, preparing them for tomorrow's mission. How many missions could they survive? How many times could they fly into Germany and come back with half their formation gone? "Mike." Kellerman's voice came from the shadows beside the operations hut. "You ready? Let me grab my sketch." "I've got it. I also got the mirrors, cutting tools, and mounting hardware. We need to work fast. If anyone asks what we're doing, we're replacing a damaged turret bearing." They walked toward Knockout Dropper in silence. The bomber sat alone on its hardstand, dark and hulking against the night sky. Most of the maintenance crews were working on aircraft with battle-damaged planes, missing engines, planes with hydraulic failures, planes with dead gunners still in their positions. Nobody paid attention to 2 men walking toward a bomber that had come back relatively intact. Romano climbed through the rear hatch and squeezed into his turret. Kellerman followed with a canvas bag full of tools. They worked by flashlight, the beam cutting through the cramped space. Romano pulled out his sketch and spread it on the ammunition boxes. "The main issue is angle," Romano said, keeping his voice low. "The mirrors need to reflect the tracer paths without distorting them. If the angle's wrong, I'll see reflections, but they won't correspond to where the rounds actually are." Kellerman studied the sketch, then looked at the turret interior. "The plexiglass curves here and here. That's actually good, it'll catch more light. We mount the primary mirror on the left side at 15 degrees, secondary mirror on the right at 20 degrees, and a third small mirror directly above the gun sight to catch overhead threats. Can we do it in one night? We'd better. Tomorrow's mission brief is at 0500 hours. Kellerman opened his canvas bag and pulled out 3 pieces of optical glass, each roughly 4 inches square. They'd been cut from P-47 gun sight reflectors, the edges still sharp. "I pulled these from the salvage yard during dinner. Technically, I signed them out for optical system repair, which isn't exactly a lie. It's not exactly the truth either. You want to follow regulations or you want to survive? Romano didn't answer. He held the flashlight while Kellerman began fabricating mounting brackets from aluminum scrap. The work was precise and slow. Each bracket had to be shaped by hand, filed down to exact dimensions, then attached to the turret frame with machine screws. One bracket took 20 minutes. They needed 3. "Tell me about Pittsburgh," Kellerman said as he worked, his voice barely audible over the rasp of the file. "You said you worked in a steel mill." "Blast furnace. Jones and Laughlin plant on the south side. Started when I was 16, quit when I was 19 to enlist. Figured anything was better than breathing iron dust for 40 years. How's that working out for you?" Romano almost laughed. "I'm in a metal tube at 25,000 feet getting shot at by German fighters with a gun sight from 1940. I'd say it's about the same as the steel mill, except the steel mill didn't actively try to kill me. The steel mill killed plenty of men, just slower." Kellerman finished the first bracket and held it up to check the angle. "My uncle worked at River Rouge. Lost 3 fingers to a press in '38. Company gave him 2 weeks' salary and fired him. Said he was a safety liability." "What did he do?" "Became a union organizer. Got blacklisted from every factory in Detroit." Kellerman attached the bracket to the turret frame and tightened the screws. "Point is, sometimes the system doesn't work. Sometimes you have to fix it yourself, even if it means breaking the rules." Romano understood. They weren't just building a mirror system. They were committing half a dozen violations of Army regulations, unauthorized modification of aircraft, use of salvaged parts without proper documentation, working on an aircraft without authorization from the engineering officer. If someone caught them, they'd face court-martial. But if they didn't do this, more tail gunners would die shooting at empty air with obsolete equipment. Kellerman finished the second bracket and started on the third. It was 2,100 hours now. They'd been working for 2 hours and still had the most delicate part ahead, mounting the mirrors themselves. The optical glass was thin and fragile. Too much pressure and it would crack. Too little and it would vibrate loose during flight. "Hand me the mirror cement," Kellerman said. Romano passed him a small tube of adhesive designed for optical applications. Kellerman applied a thin bead around the edge of the first mirror and carefully pressed it into the bracket. He held it for 60 seconds, counting under his breath, then slowly released pressure. The mirror stayed in place. "1 down," Kellerman whispered. 2 to go. They mounted the second mirror on the right side of the turret, angled to catch tracers from that direction. The third mirror, smallest of the 3, went directly above the gun sight to provide an overhead view. Each installation took 15 minutes of careful work. By the time they finished, it was 22 to 30 hours. They'd been in the turret for 3.5 hours. Romano settled into his kneeling position and looked through the gun sight. The rings and beads were the same crude arrangement as before, but now he had peripheral vision, actual visual information about where his rounds were going. He could see the reflection of his flashlight in all 3 mirrors, each one showing a slightly different angle of the turret interior. "We need to test it," Romano said. "Can't fire the guns here. You'll wake up the entire base. Dry run. We simulate a target and I track it. You watch the mirrors from behind and tell me if the reflections line up with where the guns are pointing." Kellerman squeezed in beside him, barely enough room for 2 men in the cramped space. Romano rotated the turret left and tracked an imaginary fighter. In the primary mirror, he could see the reflection of the gun barrels moving. In the secondary mirror, he saw the same movement from a different angle. The overhead mirror showed him the elevation. "It's working," Kellerman said, his voice tight with excitement. "I can see exactly where your guns are pointed just from the mirrors. If you were firing tracers, you'd see the whole flight path." "That's the theory." Romano rotated the turret right, tracking another imaginary target. The mirrors followed perfectly, showing him information his eyes couldn't see directly. "In combat, if I'm shooting behind the target, I'll see it immediately in the mirrors. I can adjust mid-burst instead of firing 100 rounds into nothing. Assuming the mirrors don't shake loose or crack from vibration. Only one way to find out." They climbed out of the turret at 2300 hours exhausted and covered in metal shavings and mirror cement. The maintenance crews were finishing up for the night, securing their tools, heading toward the barracks. No one had noticed two men spending 3 hours inside a tail turret. Or if they had noticed, they hadn't cared. "Get some sleep," Kellerman said. "Tomorrow's brief is in 6 hours. What if it doesn't work? What if the mirrors crack or the angles are wrong or... Then we fix it tomorrow night, and the night after that. We keep fixing it until it works." Kellerman's expression was hard in the darkness. "You know how many tail gunners we've lost 7 in 11 weeks. You know how many aircraft factories in Germany we've actually destroyed? None. 0. We're bleeding out over Germany for targets we can't hit with equipment that doesn't work, and the brass keeps sending us up anyway. So yeah, we're breaking regulations. We're stealing parts. We're modifying aircraft without authorization. But at least we're trying to fix the problem instead of just accepting it." Romano nodded. Kellerman was right. The system was broken, and men were dying because of it. If the mirror system worked, it could save lives. If it didn't work, they'd be no worse off than before. He walked back to his barracks, a Quonset hut that housed 30 airmen, half of whom were already asleep in their bunks. The other half sat at a table playing cards and smoking, trying not to think about tomorrow's mission. Romano's bunk was in the corner next to a small window that looked out toward the flight line. He sat down and pulled off his boots, his hands shaking now that the work was done and the adrenaline was fading. "Hey, Romano!" The voice came from the bunk across from him. Danny Foster, a waist gunner on a different crew. 20 years old, red hair, freckles. He looked like he should be delivering newspapers, not shooting at German fighters. "Heard you guys got hit hard today. 60 planes, maybe more." Jesus. Foster's face went pale. 60? Intelligence is calling it Black Thursday. Worst losses of the war. And they're sending us up again tomorrow. Romano looked at him. Foster had only been at Thorpe Abbott's for 2 weeks. He'd flown 3 missions, all of them relatively easy coastal patrols, raids on French airfields with heavy fighter escort. He hadn't seen what it was like when the Luftwaffe came in force. He hadn't seen B-17s exploding, men burning parachutes that failed to open. "Yeah," Romano said quietly. "They're sending us up again tomorrow." Foster didn't say anything. He just stared at the ceiling, his jaw working. Romano could see the fear in his face, raw and unconcealed. That's what 2 weeks looked like. After 2 months, the fear became something else, not gone, just compressed into a hard knot in your chest that you carried everywhere. After 6 months, Romano had heard you either stopped feeling fear entirely, or you went insane. He wasn't sure which was worse. He lay down on his bunk without undressing. Outside, the night was quiet, except for the occasional sound of engines being test run, their propellers beating the air. Somewhere across the base, a crew was working through the night trying to get a damaged bomber ready for tomorrow's mission. Somewhere else, a chaplain was writing letters to the families of men who died today. And in the tail turret of Knockout Dropper, 3 small mirrors waited in the darkness, waiting to prove whether one desperate idea could change anything at all. Romano closed his eyes, but didn't sleep. He thought about the fighter that had nearly killed them today, the Bf-109 that had come from behind and put cannon rounds through their stabilizer. He thought about tracking it through his gun sight, leading it exactly like the manual said, and missing. He thought about his tracers arcing into empty space while the German pilot adjusted his aim and fired again. If the mirror system worked, he would have seen his error immediately. He would have corrected mid-burst. Maybe he would have hit the fighter. Maybe Pierce and the rest of the crew would have survived one more mission. Or maybe the mirrors would crack from vibration, or reflect the wrong angles, or distract him at a critical moment and get them all killed. There was no way to know except to fly tomorrow and find out. At 0200 hours, Romano finally fell asleep. At 0445 hours, someone shook him awake. "Brief in 15 minutes. Get dressed." He pulled on his flight suit, his boots, his jacket. The other men in the barracks were moving in silence, pulling on their gear with mechanical efficiency. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. They walked through the cold darkness toward the briefing hut, their breath visible in the air, their faces gray with exhaustion. Inside, Colonel Ray was already standing beside the map. The curtain was closed. Romano found a seat and waited. His stomach felt hollow and tight at the same time. Across the aisle, he could see Foster, pale and drawn, his hands shaking as he lit a cigarette. Ray pulled the curtain. The red line was shorter today. Coastal patrol along the French border, medium-altitude bombing of rail yards. No deep penetration. Light opposition expected. A milk run. "Gentlemen," Ray said, after yesterday's losses, "Command has decided to give you an easier target today. Rail yards at Abbeville. Altitude 18,000 feet. Expected opposition is light. Maybe some flak, possibly a few fighters, but nothing like yesterday. You'll have full P-47 escort all the way to the target and back." Questions. No one spoke. A milk run meant maybe 1 or 2 aircraft lost instead of 60. It meant most of them would survive to fly again tomorrow. But it also meant Romano's mirror system would be tested against light opposition, a few fighters, not waves of them. Would that be enough to prove it worked? Dismissed. Wheels up at 0700 hours. Romano walked out into the pre-dawn darkness and headed straight for Knockout Dropper. Kellerman was already there checking the turret. He looked up as Romano approached. "Mirrors are still mounted," Kellerman said quietly. "I checked them twice. They're solid." "Good." "Mike." Kellerman's voice dropped even lower. "If this works, if you hit something today, don't tell anyone about the mirrors yet. We need more data. One mission isn't enough to prove anything. And if it doesn't work, then we try something different tomorrow night. We keep trying until we get it right." Kellerman looked at the sky where the first pale light was beginning to show in the east. "You know what my uncle used to say? The one who lost his fingers at River Rouge. He said the system only changes when ordinary people refuse to accept it. The engineers won't fix the gun sight because they think it works. The officers won't change the tactics because they think they're sound. So it's up to us, the guys actually doing the dying, to fix it ourselves." Romano climbed into his turret and settled into position. The mirrors were right where they'd mounted them, 3 small pieces of optical glass, angled to catch reflections of his tracer fire. In the growing dawn light, he could see himself reflected in each one, 3 distorted images of a tail gunner who'd spent the last 6 missions firing at nothing. Today, that was going to change. He could feel it, not confidence exactly, but something close to it. A sense that maybe finally he'd done something that might actually matter. The engines started at 0650 hours. Knockout Dropper taxied to the runway with 40 other B-17s, their propellers spinning, their crews running through final checks. Romano tested his turret controls one more time, rotating left and right, checking the mirrors. Each one showed him a slightly different view of the turret interior. In combat with tracers flying, they would show him something else, the actual flight path of his bullets, visible in real-time adjustable mid-burst. The theory was sound. But theories meant nothing at 18,000 feet with German fighters coming at you at 400 miles per hour. All stations were rolling. Pierce's voice was calm over the intercom. The bomber accelerated down the runway, lifted off, climbed into the pale morning sky. Romano watched through his window as the formation assembled 40 bombers instead of yesterday's 291. A smaller force because there weren't enough crews left to fill the sky. Yesterday had killed 60 planes and 600 men. Today, they were trying again with what was left. The formation crossed the channel at 0745 hours and entered French airspace. The P-47s formed up beside them, their stubby wings unmistakable. Romano felt tension ease slightly in his chest. Full fighter escort meant the Luftwaffe would have to get through the P-47s before they could reach the bombers. That gave the B-17s a fighting chance. "Bandits 2 o'clock high." The call came from the top turret gunner. 3 contacts, looks like 109s. Romano rotated his turret and looked up. There, 3 dark specks against the clouds circling, looking for an opening. The P-47s broke formation and climbed to intercept. One of the German fighters dove toward the bomber stream. Romano tracked him through his gun sight, waiting for range to close. 500 yards, 400, 300. Romano squeezed his triggers. The .50 calibers hammered, and in the mirrors, he saw his tracer stream arcing through space, saw exactly where his rounds were going. Too far behind. He adjusted without thinking, bringing the turret forward 2 degrees, and watched in the mirrors as his tracers walked onto target. The Bf-109's engine cowling sparked. Black smoke poured from the fighter. It rolled left and dove away, trailing fire. "Tail gun, that's a hit!" someone yelled over the intercom. "You got him, Romano?" Romano didn't answer. He was staring at the mirrors, his heart pounding. It had worked. He'd seen his tracers adjusted mid-burst and hit the target. The first confirmed kill of his career, and it had taken maybe 5 seconds from first shot to impact. 2 more fighters came in from behind. Romano tracked the first one, fired, saw his error in the mirrors corrected, and hit. The fighter pulled away, trailing smoke. The second fighter broke off before entering range. The P-47s were chasing them now, forcing them to defend instead of attack. The bombing run over Abbeville lasted 12 minutes. Light flak, no additional fighters. The formation turned for home at 09:20 hours and reached England without further incident. 1 bomber had been shot down by flak. 41 came back. They landed at Thorpe Abbotts at 10:40 hours. Romano climbed out of his turret with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Not fear this time. Something else. Relief maybe, or vindication. The mirror system worked. He'd proven it. Kellerman was waiting at the hard stand, his expression carefully neutral. "How'd it go?" "2 hits, maybe 3. I could see my rounds in the mirrors, Frank. I could see exactly where they were going and adjust in real time." "Keep your voice down." Kellerman glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "Don't tell anyone about the mirrors yet. Not until we're sure they'll hold up under sustained fire. You flew 1 mission. We need at least 5 before we present it to the brass." "5 missions? How many tail gunners are going to die in 5 missions? How many are going to die if we present this too early and the brass shut us down for unauthorized modifications?" Kellerman's voice was hard now. "We're breaking regulations, Mike. 6 different regulations. If we're going to convince them this works, we need overwhelming evidence. 1 mission isn't enough. We need data, multiple missions, multiple kills, proof that this isn't just luck." Romano wanted to argue but couldn't. Kellerman was right. The Army didn't care about 1 successful mission. They cared about statistics, repeatable results, proof that a new system would improve overall performance. And they especially didn't care about ideas from enlisted men who'd modified aircraft without authorization. 5 missions, Romano said finally. Then we show them everything. 5 missions. If you survive that long, we'll have enough data to prove the system works. If you don't... Kellerman stopped himself. If you don't survive, someone else can use the mirrors. Someone else can prove it works. That was the unspoken truth. Romano was expendable. The mirror system wasn't. Even so, in the darkness of that turret and the cold mathematics of survival, something had shifted. 1 gunner had looked at a broken system and refused to accept it. 1 mechanic had risked court-martial to help. And 1 small innovation, 3 pieces of glass mounted at precise angles, had turned missing into hitting helplessness into agency. Even in hunger and darkness, there were hearts that whispered hope. The 3rd mission came 48 hours later. Bremen again. Deep penetration, heavy opposition expected. Romano climbed into his turret at 0630 hours, with the taste of fear metallic in his mouth. The mirrors were still there, still mounted at the precise angles Kellerman had calculated. In 2 days, he'd checked them maybe 50 times, expecting to find cracks or loose brackets. There were none. The system held. "Tailgun, you awake back there?" Pierce's voice crackled through the intercom. "Awake and ready, sir." "Good. Intelligence says the 109s are concentrating on tail attacks. They think that's where we're weakest. Prove them wrong." Romano didn't answer. He knew what Pierce was really saying. Keep us alive. Keep the fighters off our tail so we can drop our bombs and go home. Simple mission parameters that ignored the fact that tail gunners had been failing at this task for 2 years straight. The formation crossed into German airspace at 0840 hours. Romano's hands were steady on the gun controls, now his breathing controlled. He'd fired 280 rounds on the last mission and scored 2 confirmed hits. That was a hit rate of less than 1%, but it was infinitely better than 0. The mirrors worked. He knew they worked. Now he had to prove it again. Bandits, 6 o'clock low. The call came from the ball turret. Whole squadron climbing fast. Romano rotated his turret down and saw them maybe 20 Bf-109s in a loose formation climbing toward the bomber stream. They'd attack from below and behind the classic tail gunner's nightmare. Closing speed would be over 500 miles per hour. He'd have maybe 3 seconds to track, aim, and fire before they flashed past. The first fighter came straight up his nose, bright with muzzle flashes. Romano tracked him through the gun sight, squeezed the trigger, and watched in the mirrors as his tracers arced 3 feet behind the target. He adjusted forward, saw the correction in real time, and walked his fire onto the fighter's wing root. Metal sparked. The 109 rolled hard left and dove away, trailing smoke. "That's a hit," someone yelled. Another fighter. Romano swung right, fired, missed, corrected in the mirrors, fired again. The fighter's canopy shattered. It spun out of control. 2 hits. Romano's got 2. A third fighter came from directly behind the hardest shot in aerial combat. Romano tracked him, led him, and fired. In the mirrors, he saw his rounds passing just under the fighter's fuselage. He elevated 1 degree and fired again. The fighter's propeller flew apart. It nosed over and fell. 3. Jesus Christ, Romano, what did you eat for breakfast? Romano didn't answer. He was breathing hard now, his shoulders aching from the recoil, his fingers cramped on the triggers. Around him the air was full of tracers, green from the German fighters, orange from the bomber guns. 2 B-17s were falling, 1 burning, 1 spinning. But the fighters were breaking off earlier now, not pressing their attacks as hard. They'd expected easy targets and found something else. The mission lasted 7 hours. Bremen was hit hard, the city covered in smoke when they turned for home. The German fighters came again on the way out, but in smaller numbers. Romano fired another 400 rounds and scored 1 more confirmed hit. 4 kills in 1 mission. The tail gun position, traditionally the least effective gun on the B-17, had just become the most deadly. They landed at 15:10 hours. Romano climbed out of his turret and his legs gave out. He collapsed on the tarmac, his whole body shaking. Kellerman pulled him to his feet. "How many?" Kellerman asked quietly. 4 confirmed. "Maybe 5. "Jesus." Kellerman's face was pale. "Mike, that's more than most tail gunners get in 20 missions." "The mirrors work, Frank. They actually work. Keep your voice down." Kellerman glanced around. The flight line was full of returning cruise mechanics officers. "Don't say anything about the mirrors." "Not yet." But it was already too late. Lieutenant Pierce was walking toward them, his face drawn, but his eyes sharp. He'd been flying B-17s for 8 months, and he knew when something was different. "Romano, a word." Romano's stomach dropped. "Yes, sir." Pierce pulled him away from the crowd toward the edge of the hard stand where they couldn't be overheard. "What did you do to your turret, sir?" "Don't play dumb with me. You scored 4 confirmed kills today. That's triple the average for an entire squadron of tail gunners. Either you're the luckiest son of a bitch in the Air Corps, or you modified something. Which is it?" Romano looked at Kellerman. The mechanic's expression was carefully neutral, but Romano could see the calculation in his eyes. Tell the truth and risk court-martial. Lie and miss the chance to save lives. There was no good option. "We installed mirrors, sir," Romano said finally. 3 small mirrors at angles that let me see my tracer paths in real time. I can adjust my fire mid-burst instead of guessing. Pierce stared at him. You modified an aircraft weapon system without authorization. Yes, sir. You used salvaged parts from damaged fighters. Yes, sir. You violated at least 6 technical regulations. Yes, sir. Romano's voice was steady now. And I scored 4 kills today instead of 0. The system works. Pierce was silent for a long moment, his jaw working. Finally, he said, "Show me." Romano led him to the tail turret and squeezed inside. Pierce leaned in through the hatch, his eyes moving over the 3 small mirrors mounted at precise angles. He could see how they were positioned to catch reflections of tracer fire, how they provided peripheral vision that the standard gun sight couldn't offer. "This is brilliant," Pierce said quietly, "and completely unauthorized. You know what Colonel Ray will do if he finds out you've been flying with modified equipment? Court-martial, sir. Probably both of us." Romano looked directly at Pierce. "But how many tail gunners have we lost since I got here? 7. And how many German fighters have those 7 men shot down? Maybe 10 total. We're dying for nothing, sir. The gun sight doesn't work. Everyone knows it doesn't work. But nobody with the authority to fix it cares, because they're not the ones sitting back here watching fighters blow past while we shoot at empty air." Pierce's expression hardened. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't see the casualty reports? I've lost 2 tail gunners in 4 months. Good men. Jenkins was 20 years old. He had a wife and a baby daughter he never met. And you're telling me he died because the Army won't update a gun sight? I'm telling you we can fix it ourselves, sir, right now, tonight. We can install mirror systems in every B-17 in the squadron, and by tomorrow morning we'll have 40 effective tail gunners instead of 40 targets waiting to die. That would require authorization from Colonel Ray, and Ray would need authorization from Group, and Group would need authorization from 8th Air Force. By the time all those authorizations come through, we'll have lost another 20 tail gunners." "So we do it without authorization," Kellerman said. He'd been standing silent at the edge of the hardstand, but now he stepped forward. "We install them tonight on every bomber in the squadron. We do it quietly. We do it fast. And tomorrow when those gunners come back with improved kill rates, we present the data to Colonel Ray and let him decide whether to court-martial us or give us medals." Pierce looked at both of them. "That's insubordination. That's saving lives, sir. If this goes wrong, if even one of those mirrors fails and causes an accident, I'll be the one explaining to Group why we modified 40 aircraft without authorization. And if we don't do it," Romano said quietly, "you'll be explaining to 40 families why their sons died with equipment we knew didn't work and chose not to fix." The words hung in the air between them. Pierce looked at the mirror system again, then at Romano, then at Kellerman. Finally, he said, "How fast can you install these?" Kellerman's face was stone, but his eyes were alive. "If I pull every mechanic in the squadron, we can do 40 bombers in one night. We'll need more mirrors, more mounting hardware, and everyone needs to keep their mouth shut. The P-47's in the salvage yard. There's at least 15 with intact gun sights. That's 45 mirrors enough for 15 bombers. For the rest, we'll need to cannibalize damaged B-17 reflector sights." Pierce's mind was racing now, working through logistics. "We tell the mechanics it's an authorized field modification, emergency authorization from Group. They don't need to know we're lying." "Sir," Romano said, "this could end your career." "My career doesn't mean shit if my crews keep dying." Pierce's voice was hard now, final. "We install them tonight. Every bomber that's flight ready gets the mirror system. We fly tomorrow and we prove it works. If it does, Ray will forgive the insubordination because the data will be undeniable. If it doesn't..." He stopped himself. "If it doesn't work, we're all going to prison." Kellerman was already moving, pulling a notepad from his pocket and sketching dimensions. "I'll need the salvage yard opened, and I'll need every mechanic who can hold a drill." "You've got them. I'll talk to Master Sergeant Collins. He owes me a favor." Pierce looked at Romano. You're going to teach 20 mechanics how to install these mirrors. You've got 1 hour to figure out how to explain it so they don't screw it up." Romano nodded, his heart hammering. 1 hour to teach 20 men a process he'd only done once. 1 night to modify 40 bombers. 1 mission to prove the system worked or destroy 3 careers. The stakes had just multiplied by 40. Pierce walked away toward the operations building. Kellerman grabbed Romano's arm. "Can you actually teach this? The angles have to be precise. 1 degree off and the whole thing is useless." "I can teach it. I learned fabrication at the steel mill. These guys are aircraft mechanics. They're not stupid. Give me templates and measuring tools, and they'll get it right." They'd better, because if even one of those installations fails tomorrow and causes a bomber to crash, Pierce is done. We're done. And the mirror system gets banned before it can save anyone. They worked through the afternoon creating templates. Precise patterns cut from aluminum that showed exactly where each mirror needed to be mounted at exactly what angle. By 1800 hours, they had 3 templates, and Romano had practiced his explanation until he could deliver it in under 5 minutes. By 1900 hours, Master Sergeant Collins had assembled 20 mechanics in the machine shop, their faces curious and skeptical. "Gentlemen," Pierce said, standing at the front of the shop, "tonight we're installing a new targeting system on every operational B-17 in the squadron. This system was developed by one of our gunners and has proven effective in combat. The installation is straightforward, but requires precision. Sergeant Romano will explain the procedure. You'll work in teams of 2-1 bomber per team. I want every installation completed by 0400 hours. Questions?" A mechanic in the back raised his hand. "Sir, is this authorized by group?" "It's authorized by me. That's all you need to know. Romano, teach them." Romano stepped forward with his templates and a sample mirror assembly. The system uses 3 optical mirrors mounted at precise angles inside the tail turret. These mirrors reflect the gunner's tracer paths, providing real-time visual feedback that allows mid-burst correction. The primary mirror mounts on the left side at 15 degrees secondary, on the right at 20 degrees tertiary, above the gun sight at 30 degrees. You'll use these templates to mark the mounting positions. The brackets must be filed to exact dimensions. Even a quarter-degree error makes the system useless. The mirrors are fragile. Handle them like you'd handle oxygen regulators. Questions? "Where are we getting 40 mirrors?" someone asked. Kellerman stepped forward. "Salvage yard. We're pulling reflector assemblies from damaged P-47s and B-17s. The optical glass is standard issue. We're just repurposing it." "That's theft of military property." "That's saving lives," Pierce said coldly. "Anyone who has a problem with that can leave right now." No one moved. "Good. Get to work. I want status reports every 2 hours." The mechanics dispersed to their assigned bombers. Romano and Kellerman moved from crew to crew, checking installations, correcting errors, explaining the angles over and over. By midnight, they'd completed 15 installations. By 0200 hours, they'd completed 30. By 0400 hours, with the eastern sky beginning to lighten, they finished the 40th and final bomber. Romano stood on the flight line, exhausted beyond thought, and looked at the rows of B-17s sitting silent in the pre-dawn darkness. 40 bombers. 40 tail gunners who would climb into their turrets today and find 3 small mirrors waiting for them. 40 men who might survive because 2 people had refused to accept a broken system. "Mission brief in 1 hour," Kellerman said quietly. "You should get some sleep." "Can't sleep. Too wired." "Then get some coffee. You're flying today and you need to be sharp." Romano walked to the mess hall and poured himself a cup of coffee so strong it tasted like battery acid. Around him, other crews were eating breakfast in silence, their faces drawn. Nobody talked about yesterday's losses anymore. There was no point. Men died and were replaced and died again. That was the rhythm of strategic bombing. The only thing that mattered was surviving your next mission. At 0500 hours, they assembled in the briefing hut. Colonel Ray stood beside the covered map, his expression unreadable. Romano sat in the back, his stomach tight with anticipation. If Ray had discovered the unauthorized modifications, he'd announce it now. If he hadn't, they had one mission to prove the system worked before anyone noticed. Ray pulled the curtain. The red line stretched to Castle. Deep penetration, heavy opposition, no fighter escort for the final leg. Another Black Thursday in the making. "Gentlemen," Ray said, "you're hitting the aircraft factories at Castle. Intelligence says this is a critical target. Expected losses are..." He paused. "Significant. But necessary. Dismissed." Romano walked out into the cold morning air and headed for Knockout Dropper. The bomber sat on its hard stand, looking no different than yesterday. But in the tail turret, invisible to casual inspection, 3 mirrors waited to change everything. Pierce caught up with him at the hard stand. 40 bombers, 40 mirror systems. If this works, Romano, you'll have saved more lives than most pilots save in their entire career. If it doesn't work, we'll spend the next 5 years in Leavenworth. No pressure. Yes, sir, no pressure at all. Romano climbed into his turret and settled into position. The mirrors reflected his face back at him in triplicate 3 distorted images of a tail gunner who'd gone from 0 kills to 6 kills in 3 missions. Around him, in 40 other B-17s, 40 other tail gunners were seeing the same mirrors and wondering what they were for. By tonight, they'd know. By tonight, the data would be undeniable. The formation took off at 0700 hours. 40 bombers climbing into the pale morning sky, their gunners armed with a system that hadn't been tested, hadn't been approved, hadn't even been acknowledged by anyone with the authority to authorize it. It was the most dangerous kind of innovation, the kind born from desperation and implemented through insubordination. They crossed into German airspace at 0920 hours. The Luftwaffe was waiting. FW-190s and Bf-109s came at them in waves, attacking from every angle. Romano fired and adjusted and fired again, his tracers visible in the mirrors, his corrections instantaneous. Around him, other tail gunners were doing the same. The radio filled with excited voices. "Got him! I got him! 2 hits from tailgun position. They're breaking off. The fighters are breaking off." The German pilots had expected easy targets and found something else. Tail gunners who could actually hit them. The attacks became more cautious, the fighters standing off at longer range where the bomber guns were less accurate. 3 B-17s went down during the entire mission, not 60, not 40, just 3. And the tail gunners scored 47 confirmed kills. They landed at 15:30 hours. Romano climbed out of his turret to find Colonel Ray waiting at the hard stand, his expression thunderous. "Lieutenant Pierce, Sergeant Romano, Sergeant Kellerman, my office, now." They followed him across the tarmac to the operations building and into his office. Ray closed the door and turned to face them. "I've just received reports from 40 different crews about unauthorized modifications to their tailgun positions. 40 crews who scored 47 confirmed kills in a single mission. That's more than we usually get in a week. Someone want to explain what's going on?" Pierce stepped forward. "Sir, I authorized a field modification to improve tail gunner effectiveness. The system uses mirrors to provide real-time visual feedback." "I know what the system does, Lieutenant. What I want to know is why you installed it on 40 bombers without consulting me first." "Because men were dying, sir. And the standard gun sight wasn't working. We had the solution and we didn't have time to wait for authorization." Ray's jaw tightened. "You violated 6 different technical regulations. You used unauthorized parts. You modified critical weapon systems without engineering approval. You could be court-martialed for this." "Yes, sir, we know." "But you did it anyway, because you thought you knew better than the Air Corps engineers who designed these systems." Romano spoke up. "Sir, the Air Corps engineers aren't sitting in tail turrets watching fighters blow past while we shoot at nothing. We are. and we fixed the problem they either couldn't see or didn't care about. Ray was silent for a long moment. Then he walked to his desk and picked up a folder. I've already sent a report to Group about today's mission. 47 confirmed kills from tailgun positions. 3 bombers lost instead of the 15 we expected. The data is undeniable. The system works. He looked at Pierce. Which means I can't court-martial you without explaining to Group why I'm punishing the men who just tripled our defensive effectiveness. Pierce's expression didn't change, but Romano saw the tension leave his shoulders. Does that mean? It means I'm going to pretend I authorized this modification 3 days ago. It means I'm sending your design to 8th Air Force with a recommendation for immediate fleet-wide implementation. And it means all 3 of you are going to write detailed technical manuals explaining how to install these mirrors so we can equip every B-17 in the European theater. Ray's voice was hard. But make no mistake, if you ever pull something like this again, without my explicit authorization, I will have you shot. Understood? Yes, sir. Understood. Good. Now get out of my office and write those manuals. I want them on my desk by tomorrow morning. They walked out into the afternoon sunlight. Pierce started laughing, a sharp, almost hysterical sound. We just got away with it. Jesus Christ, we actually got away with it. Kellerman was grinning. 47 kills. The data doesn't lie. Romano didn't say anything. He was thinking about the tail gunners and 40 other bombers men he'd never met who'd survived today because of 3 small mirrors. He was thinking about the tail gunners who would survive tomorrow and next week and next month as the system spread through the fleet. Simple innovation, born from desperation, implemented through courage. In a system built to silence dissent, whispers still crossed the wire. The technical manual took Romano 3 sleepless nights to write. He sat at a desk in the operations building with drafting paper rulers and a pencil worn down to a nub, trying to translate what his hands knew into words and diagrams that mechanics across England could follow. Kellerman worked beside him, checking measurements, correcting angles, making sure every specification was precise enough that a mechanic who'd never seen the system could install it correctly. Section 4 needs more detail, Kellerman said, circling a paragraph. You're assuming they know how to calculate reflection angles. Most of them don't. Romano rubbed his eyes. It was 0200 hours on the 3rd night, and he'd slept maybe 6 hours total since the castle mission. I'll add a diagram showing the geometry. Mirror angle equals half the desired deflection angle. Simple trigonometry. Nothing simple when you're working by flashlight in a tail turret at midnight. Kellerman pushed a fresh sheet of paper across the desk. Start over. Assume the mechanic is 19 years old and barely passed high school math. Walk him through every single step like you're teaching a child. Romano started over. By 0600 hours, they had a 20-page manual with detailed diagrams, step-by-step instructions, and a troubleshooting section covering every error they'd encountered during the original 40 installations. Kellerman read through it twice, making notes, asking questions, forcing Romano to clarify anything that wasn't immediately obvious. This'll work, Kellerman said finally. A competent mechanic can follow this. An incompetent one will screw it up, but an incompetent mechanic screws up everything. They delivered the manual to Colonel Ray at 0700 hours. He flipped through it without expression, his eyes moving over the diagrams and specifications. This is good work. Detailed, precise, comprehensive. I'm forwarding it to 8th Air Force today with a recommendation for immediate fleet-wide adoption. He looked up at Romano. How many missions have you flown with this system? 4, sir. 11 confirmed kills total. And your hit rate before the mirrors? 0, sir. Ray's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. 0 to 11 in 4 missions. That's not an incremental improvement. That's a fundamental change in capability. He closed the manual. 8th Air Force is going to want to test this. They'll send an evaluation team probably within a week. They'll fly with you. Observe the system in combat, and if they like what they see, they'll authorize mass production. You'll be assigned to help with testing and training. No more combat missions until the evaluation is complete. Romano felt relief wash through him so intensely, it was almost painful. No more missions meant no more chances to die in a tail turret. But it also meant other men would be flying those missions without him. And if they died because they didn't have mirrors yet, that would be on him too. "Sir," Romano said carefully. "Respectfully, I should keep flying. The more data we gather, the more convincing the case for adoption. The more missions you fly, the higher the probability you'll be killed. And if you're killed, who trains the mechanics on proper installation? Who answers questions when group wants to know why a mirror shattered or an angle was wrong?" Ray's voice was firm. "You're more valuable on the ground right now. That's not up for debate." Pierce spoke up from where he'd been standing silent by the door. "Sir, what about the other tail gunners in the squadron? They're flying with the mirrors, but they haven't been trained on the theory. If something goes wrong, they won't know how to adjust." "Then you'd better start training them. I want every tail gunner in this squadron to understand how the system works and how to use it effectively. You've got 3 days before the evaluation team arrives." Ray dismissed them with a wave. "Get to work." Romano spent the next 3 days running training sessions in a mock-up tail turret that maintenance had built in a hangar. 23 tail gunners cycled through in groups of 4, learning how to read the mirrors, how to correct for deflection errors, how to adjust for target speed and angle. Some of them picked it up immediately. Others struggled their eyes, unable to process the peripheral information from the mirrors, while simultaneously tracking targets through the main gun sight. "It's too much information," one gunner complained. "I can't watch 3 mirrors and the target at the same time." "You're not watching the mirrors constantly," Romano explained for the 10th time. "You watch the target through the gun sight. The mirrors are peripheral vision. You're aware of them without focusing on them. When your tracers appear in the mirrors, you process that information unconsciously and adjust. It's like driving a car. You watch the road ahead, but you're also aware of your mirrors showing you what's beside and behind you." "I've never driven a car." "Then trust me, it works. You flew 3 missions with these mirrors and you're still alive. That should tell you something." The gunner nodded reluctantly and went back to practicing. Romano watched him track an imaginary target, his movements jerky and uncertain. It would come with time, or the gunner would die before he figured it out. That was the brutal calculus of aerial combat. You learned fast, or you died. The evaluation team arrived on October 27th, 13 days after Black Thursday. 3 officers from 8th Air Force Headquarters, accompanied by 2 engineers from Wright Field and a photographer who documented everything. They examined Romano's mirror installation, measured the angles, questioned the theory, and requested a combat demonstration. "We'd like to observe the system in actual combat conditions," the lead evaluator said. He was a major named Harrison, thin and pale, with round glasses that made him look like an accountant. "We'll fly with your squadron tomorrow. I'll observe from Lieutenant Pierce's aircraft with Sergeant Romano in the tail gun position demonstrating the system." "Sir," Ray interjected, "I've grounded Sergeant Romano from combat operations. I'm ungrounding him for one mission. We need to see the system used by the man who invented it under realistic combat conditions. If it performs as reported, we'll authorize immediate production." Harrison's tone made it clear this wasn't negotiable. So Romano found himself back in the tail turret of Knockout Dropper at 0630 hours on October 28th, with Major Harrison squeezed into the cramped space beside him, watching everything. The mission was Frankfurt, another deep penetration, another day of fighters and flak and burning bombers falling out of formation. They crossed into German airspace at 0920 hours. Harrison had a clipboard and was taking notes, his expression clinical and detached. Romano wondered what it was like to observe combat as an academic exercise instead of living it as a fight for survival. "Bandits 6 o'clock high," the ball turret gunner announced. Romano rotated the turret and tracked the approaching fighters. There were 12 of them, FW-190s this time, faster and more heavily armed than the BF-109s. They came in line astern, one after another, giving each pilot a clean shot at the bomber formation. "Engage when ready," Pierce said over the intercom. The first fighter dove. Romano tracked him through the gun sight, watching his closure rate. At 400 yards, he squeezed the triggers. The .50 calibers hammered, and in the mirrors, Romano saw his tracer stream, saw it immediately. Clearly, saw exactly where his rounds were going. 6 feet low. He adjusted up 1 degree and watched the tracers walk onto target. The fighter's engine cowling sparked. Black smoke poured out. The fighter rolled away. "Hit," Harrison said, clinically making a note. Time from first round to impact approximately 2.3 seconds. That's significantly faster than standard engagement times. Another fighter. Romano tracked fired, saw his error in the mirrors, corrected hit. The fighter's canopy shattered. It spun out of control. 2 hits in 30 seconds, Harrison murmured. Extraordinary. The rest of the fighters broke off the attack earlier than usual, standing off at longer range where the bomber guns were less effective. They'd learned that tail gunners were no longer easy targets. The entire dynamic of the air battle had shifted. The mission lasted 6 hours. Romano fired 820 rounds and scored 5 confirmed kills. Harrison filled 12 pages with notes and took 37 photographs. When they landed at Thorpe Abbott's at 1440 hours, Harrison's clinical detachment had been replaced by barely suppressed excitement. "This system is revolutionary," Harrison said as they climbed out of the bomber. "It solves a fundamental problem that's plagued aerial gunnery since the beginning of the war. The Air Corps has been trying to develop computing gun sights for 3 years without success. You solved it with 3 pieces of glass and basic geometry." "So you'll authorize production?" Ray asked. "I'll recommend immediate authorization. Mass production of mirror kits installation across the entire 8th Air Force bomber fleet, and mandatory training for all tail gunners. We're looking at maybe 6 weeks to full implementation." Harrison paused. "Sergeant Romano, the Air Corps is going to want you to help with that implementation. Training instructors, supervising installations, troubleshooting problems. You'd be reassigned to Wright Field probably for the duration of the war. Are you willing?" Romano looked at Pierce at Kellerman at the B-17s lined up along the flight line. He thought about the 7 tail gunners who'd died before he'd installed the mirrors. He thought about the thousands of tail gunners across England who were still flying with obsolete gun sights, shooting at nothing, dying for equipment that didn't work. "Yes, sir," Romano said. "I'm willing." The next 6 weeks were a blur of activity. Romano was transferred to Wright Field in Ohio, where he worked 18-hour days with engineers and production specialists refining the mirror design for mass production, creating training materials, supervising the manufacturing of 2,000 mirror kits. The engineers wanted to complicate it, add computing mechanisms, integrate it with existing gunsight systems, make it sophisticated and expensive. Romano fought them at every step. "It needs to be simple," he insisted during one heated meeting. "Simple enough that a 19-year-old mechanic can install it in 30 minutes by flashlight. Simple enough that it can't break down. Simple enough that when a gunner's hands are frozen and he can barely breathe and fighters are coming at him at 500 miles per hour, he doesn't have to think about how it works. He just uses it." They listened because the data was undeniable. By December 1943, the mirror system had been installed on 847 B-17s across the 8th Air Force. Tail gunner effectiveness increased by 340%. Bomber losses from rear attacks decreased by 38%. The Luftwaffe adjusted their tactics, attacking from different angles. But the fundamental equation had changed. Tail gunners could hit what they aimed at. In January 1944, Boeing incorporated the mirror system into the Cheyenne tail turret design, a fully integrated version with built-in reflectors and improved optics. By March 1944, every new B-17 rolling off the production line came equipped with what the Air Corps was calling the Romano Reflector System. By June, over 3,000 bombers were flying with the mirrors. Romano never flew another combat mission. He spent the rest of the war at Wright Field, training instructors, troubleshooting installations, testifying before congressional committees about weapons system development. The work was important, but he felt disconnected from it, like he was watching someone else's life from a distance. The war he'd known, the terror and violence and desperate innovation, had been replaced by meetings and paperwork and official commendations. In April 1945, he received a letter from Lieutenant Pierce. The crew of Knockout Dropper had completed their 25-mission tour and were being sent home. Pierce wrote, "We made it, Mike, all 10 of us. Not one casualty. I can't prove the mirrors are why we survived, but I believe it. Every tail gunner in the squadron believes it. You saved lives. Don't ever forget that." Romano folded the letter and put it in his footlocker with the original sketch he'd drawn that night after Black Thursday. 3 mirrors at precise angles, rough pencil lines on greasy paper. He looked at it sometimes and tried to remember what it had felt like to be that desperate, that determined to fix something everyone else had accepted as unfixable. The war ended in May 1945. Romano was discharged in July with a Distinguished Flying Cross and a commendation from General Carl Spaatz, commander of U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe. The commendation cited him for extraordinary innovation in aerial gunnery that resulted in significant reduction of bomber losses and saved an estimated 840 aircraft and 400 aircrew lives. He went back to Pittsburgh and got his old job at the steel mill. He never talked about the war, never mentioned the mirrors, never told anyone that he'd changed aerial combat doctrine for the entire U.S. Army Air Forces. When co-workers asked what he'd done during the war, he said, "Tail gunner, nothing special." But in bases across England and France and later Germany, tail gunners climbed into their turrets and saw 3 small mirrors reflecting their tracer fire, and they adjusted their aim mid-burst, and they hit their targets, and they survived. They didn't know Romano's name or his story. They just knew the mirrors worked, and they were grateful for whoever had invented them. In 1952, Romano received a letter from the Air Force Historical Division requesting an interview about the development of the mirror gunsight system. He declined. "It was a long time ago," he wrote back. "I don't remember much about it." That was a lie. He remembered everything. He remembered Black Thursday and 60 burning bombers. He remembered the desperate sketch in a greasy notebook. He remembered Kellerman saying, "Sometimes you have to fix it yourself, even if it means breaking the rules." He remembered Pierce risking his career to install 40 unauthorized modifications in one night. He remembered looking through his gun sight and finally, after months of missing, seeing his tracers walk onto target. But he also remembered Jenkins dying over Bremen and Miller burning over Wilhelmshaven and 7 other tail gunners whose names he'd forgotten, but whose faces still appeared in his dreams sometimes. The mirrors had saved thousands of lives, but they'd come too late for the men who'd died before he'd figured it out. That guilt never left him. He worked at the steel mill for 33 years, retired in 1978, and died in 2003 at age 82. The obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette was 3 sentences long. Michael Romano, 82, retired steelworker and U.S. Air Force veteran, died peacefully at his home. He is survived by his wife of 58 years, 2 daughters, and 5 grandchildren. Services will be private. There was no mention of the mirrors, or the lives saved, or the innovation that had changed aerial warfare. Just a retired steelworker who'd done his duty and come home and lived a quiet life. But in museums and military histories and engineering textbooks, the Romano Reflector System was documented and analyzed and celebrated as one of the most effective field modifications of World War II. And in the logbooks of thousands of bomber crews, there were notations like "tail gunner effective" and "rear attacks repulsed" and "all crew returned safely," small bureaucratic phrases that meant men lived instead of died. In the end, that was all that mattered. Not recognition or glory or official commendation. Just the quiet knowledge that when the system was broken and men were dying, one person had refused to accept it. One person had looked at a problem everyone else considered unsolvable and said, "We can fix this." One person had taken 3 pieces of glass and changed everything. Freedom came not in liberation or parades, but in the slow accumulation of small victories. Each mirror installed was a small victory. Each gunner trained was a small victory. Each bomber that returned intact was a small victory. And those small victories, multiplied across thousands of missions and tens of thousands of men, became something larger than any individual could have imagined. Romano never saw himself as a hero. He'd just been a scared kid in a tail turret who couldn't hit anything and refused to keep dying quietly. But in the mathematics of war, where every life saved cascaded into families not destroyed and futures not erased, his innovation had echoed forward through time in ways impossible to measure. The mirrors had done their work. The system had changed. And somewhere in that cold geometry of reflection and correction and precision, humanity had found a way to push back against the machinery of death, even if it came too late for thousands who'd already vanished into smoke and fire and the endless sky. But that quiet ending the steel mill, the obituary the life lived, in deliberate obscurity that came decades later. In the winter of 1944, while Romano was at Wright Field teaching mechanics how to mount mirrors at 15-degree angles, the war was still grinding forward, and men were still dying, and the mirrors were still spreading through the bomber fleet like wildfire through dry grass. Lieutenant Bob Pierce flew his 25th and final mission on February 3, 1944. He'd survived what most crews didn't, a complete tour without losing a single man. When he climbed out of knockout dropper for the last time, he stood on the tarmac, looking at the tail turret, and thought about Jenkins, who'd died in that position before Romano. He thought about the 7 other tail gunners the squadron had lost before the mirrors. And he thought about the fact that not one tail gunner had been killed since the mirrors went in. "You still there, sir?" His co-pilot, a kid named Matthews, who was 20 years old and looked 16, stood beside him. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how many men would still be alive if we'd had those mirrors 6 months ago." Matthews didn't answer. There was no answer. You couldn't rewrite history. You could only change what came next. Pierce went home to Iowa and tried to forget the war. He couldn't. He'd wake up at night hearing the sound of engines, feeling the aircraft shudder from flak impacts, seeing fighters diving through the formation. But the nightmares were bearable because he'd brought his whole crew home. 10 men who'd climbed into knockout dropper and climbed back out mission after mission until their tour was done. That was rare. That was almost miraculous. And Pierce knew it was because Romano had refused to accept a system that didn't work. Frank Kellerman stayed at Thorpe Abbotts until the war ended. He became the squadron's senior technical sergeant, responsible for maintaining the mirror systems and training new mechanics on proper installation. He filled notebooks with observations, which angles worked best in different lighting conditions, how to prevent mirror fogging at high-altitude modifications to reduce vibration. The notebooks eventually made their way to Wright Field, where engineers incorporated the improvements into later production models. In March 1945, Kellerman received a letter from a tail gunner named Williams, who was flying with the 94th Bomb Group. Williams had been shot down over Berlin, captured, and spent 4 months in a POW camp. He wrote, "The German interrogator asked me about the mirrors. He wanted to know how they worked when they'd been installed, how many bombers had them. I told him I didn't know anything about mirrors." But the fact that he was asking meant the Luftwaffe had noticed. It meant we'd changed something fundamental about the air war. I thought you should know that. Kellerman showed the letter to Ray. The colonel read it twice, then filed it away without comment. But that night, he called Kellerman into his office and poured 2 glasses of whiskey, a violation of about 6 different regulations. But Ray didn't care anymore. The war was nearly over, and they'd both survived, and sometimes you needed to mark that with something stronger than coffee. "You know what bothers me most," Ray said, staring into his glass. "We could have done this 2 years earlier. The technology wasn't complicated. The mirrors were available. The geometry was basic optics. Any competent engineer could have designed this system in 1942. But nobody did. You know why? Because nobody asked the tail gunners what they needed, Kellerman said. Because the people designing the systems weren't the people using them. Because there's a vast bureaucratic distance between right field and a tail turret at 25,000 feet over Germany. Because the Army doesn't like solutions that come from sergeants instead of officers. Ray drained his whiskey. Romano broke every rule in the book, and he saved thousands of lives by doing it. That's going to haunt me. Why should it haunt you? You supported him after he'd already built it, after he'd already proven it worked. But if he'd come to me first with just a sketch and an idea, would I have authorized it? Or would I have told him to follow proper channels and wait for engineering approval? Ray refilled both glasses. I think I would have shut him down. I think I would have followed regulations and let men keep dying because that's what colonels do. We maintain order. We enforce rules. And sometimes those rules kill people. Kellerman didn't argue because Ray was probably right. The system only changed because Romano had bypassed it entirely. He'd built the mirrors in secret, installed them without permission, and presented the brass with data they couldn't ignore. If he'd asked first, the answer would have been no. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Kellerman was discharged 6 weeks later and went back to Detroit. He got his old job at the River Rouge plant, the same factory where his uncle had lost 3 fingers to a press. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 3 years fixing bombers in England, and now he was back to fixing cars in Michigan. Same work, different stakes. But he couldn't forget the mirrors. He'd lie awake at night doing the mathematics in his head. If the mirror system had prevented 38% of rear attack losses, and if those losses had averaged 15 bombers per week across a 2-year period, that meant the mirrors had saved roughly 840 aircraft. At 10 men per aircraft, that was 8,400 lives. 8,400 men who went home to their families instead of dying over Germany. And all it had taken was 1 desperate gunner and 3 pieces of glass. In 1947, Kellerman received an invitation to speak at the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. They were dedicating an exhibit on tactical innovations in World War II and wanted him to discuss the Romano Reflector System. He almost declined. He didn't like public speaking, and he didn't think of himself as anyone special. But then he thought about Romano, who'd refused all interviews and disappeared back into civilian life. Someone needed to tell the story. Someone needed to explain how innovation actually happened, not in laboratories and committee meetings, but in the desperate spaces where men faced death and refused to accept it. The museum exhibit opened on November 15, 1947. Kellerman stood in front of maybe 40 people, veterans engineers, military historians, and told them about Black Thursday. He told them about 60 bombers falling out of the sky. He told them about Romano sketching mirror angles in a greasy notebook. He told them about installing 40 unauthorized modifications in one night while violating 6 different regulations. The thing you have to understand, Kellerman said, is that this wasn't some brilliant inventor working in a laboratory. This was a scared kid who couldn't hit anything and refused to keep dying quietly. He didn't have advanced degrees or engineering training. He'd dropped out of high school to work in a steel mill. But he understood the problem better than all the experts at Wright Field because he was living the problem. And he fixed it with materials we stole from a salvage yard. A hand went up in the audience. Did he face disciplinary action for the unauthorized modifications? Almost. Colonel Ray could have court-martialed all 3 of us, but the data was so compelling he had no choice but to approve it retroactively. Sometimes the only way to change a broken system is to break the rules. After the presentation, a young captain approached Kellerman. He couldn't have been more than 25, his uniform crisp and new. Sergeant Kellerman, I'm with Air Force Research and Development. We're working on computing gun sights for the new B-36 bomber. Would you be willing to consult? We could use someone who understands practical implementation. Kellerman looked at him. You want to know the secret to practical implementation? Ask the guys who will actually use the system. Not the officers, Not the engineers. The 18-year-old kids sitting in the gun turrets. They'll tell you what works and what doesn't. And when they tell you something doesn't work, listen to them. We do listen. No, you don't. If you listened, Romano wouldn't have needed to build the mirrors in secret. He would have walked into an office, explained the problem, and someone with authority would have said, "Good idea. Let's try it." Instead, he had to violate 6 regulations and risk court-martial just to save his own life. Kellerman's voice was harder now. The military is very good at killing people, and very bad at listening to the people doing the killing. Until that changes, you're going to keep having sergeants who bypass the system because the system doesn't work. The captain left, looking uncomfortable. Kellerman didn't care. He'd spent 3 years watching good ideas get buried under bureaucracy, and bad ideas get approved because they came from officers. The mirror system had only succeeded because Romano had circumvented the entire process. That shouldn't have been necessary. But it was. In 1952, the Air Force published an official history of tactical innovations in World War II. The Romano Reflector System received 4 pages of detailed analysis, including technical diagrams, installation procedures, and statistical data on effectiveness. The history concluded, this field modification developed by enlisted personnel without official authorization represents one of the most significant improvements in defensive armament effectiveness during the war. It demonstrates the value of bottom-up innovation and the importance of practical combat experience in weapon system development. Romano read the history once and put it away in a drawer. He didn't want to think about the war anymore. He had a wife, 2 daughters, a job at the steel mill. That was enough. But sometimes at night, he'd wake up from dreams of fighters diving through his gun sight, and he'd lie in the darkness thinking about the men who'd died before he'd figured out the mirrors. Jenkins and Miller, and 5 others, whose names he'd forgotten. They haunted him more than any commendation could comfort him. His wife Sarah knew something was wrong, but she didn't push. She'd learned early in their marriage that Romano didn't talk about the war. He'd come home in 1945, thin and silent, and she'd asked once what it had been like. He'd said loud and never elaborated. So she let him carry whatever weight he was carrying and tried to make home a place where he could put it down occasionally. In 1968, Romano's oldest daughter brought home a boyfriend who was about to ship out to Vietnam. The kid was 19, cocky, certain he was going to be a hero. Romano listened to him talk about adventure and duty and proving himself, and finally he couldn't take it anymore. "You think war is going to make you a hero?" Romano said quietly. "I think it's an opportunity to serve my country, sir. War is an opportunity to die scared and alone at 20 years old. It's an opportunity to watch your friends burn. It's an opportunity to discover that the equipment doesn't work and the tactics are wrong, and the people making decisions have never been where you are. If you're very lucky and very smart, you might find a way to survive. But you won't be a hero. You'll just be traumatized." The kid stared at him. Sarah tried to diffuse the tension, but Romano wasn't done. "If you do survive," Romano continued, "here's what you do. You find the thing that's broken and killing people. You fix it. You don't wait for permission. You don't follow proper channels. You fix it yourself, because nobody else will. And maybe that saves some lives. And maybe 50 years later, someone will write a 4-page summary in a history book. But the men who died before you fixed it, they're still dead. You remember that." The kid went to Vietnam. He came back 13 months later, missing his left arm below the elbow and something essential behind his eyes. He never talked about what happened there. Romano understood. In 1989, Romano received a letter from a man named David Williams, who identified himself as the son of a B-17 tail gunner. His father had died 6 months earlier. But before he died, he'd told David about the mirrors, how they'd appeared one day in his turret without explanation, how they'd changed everything, how he'd survived 23 missions because he could finally see where his bullets were going. "My father never knew who invented the system," David wrote. "He called it the magic mirrors because they appeared like magic and worked like magic. but I did some research and found your name in the Air Force archives. I wanted to thank you. My father lived to be 73 years old. He had 4 children, 11 grandchildren, and a good life. None of that would have existed without your innovation. You didn't just save his life, you saved all the lives that came after. Romano read the letter 3 times, then put it in his drawer with the Air Force history and the original sketch he'd made that night after Black Thursday. He didn't answer the letter. What could he say? You're welcome for your father's life. Sorry about the 1,000 other fathers who died before I figured it out. There were no adequate words, but he kept the letter. And sometimes, when the guilt got too heavy, the guilt about Jenkins and Miller and all the others, he'd take out David Williams's letter and read it again. 1 man saved. 1 life that cascaded forward into 4 children and 11 grandchildren and probably more to come. Multiply that by 8,400 and you got something too large to conceptualize. Generations that existed because of 3 pieces of glass mounted at 15-degree angles. Romano died on March 14, 2003. His funeral was small family. A few co-workers from the steel mill, some neighbors. No military honor guard. No representatives from the Air Force. He'd requested a simple service with no mention of the war. Sarah honored that request even though she thought he deserved recognition. But Romano had never wanted recognition. He'd just wanted to survive, and he'd wanted other men to survive too. 3 months after the funeral, Sarah received a package from the National Air and Space Museum. Inside was a photograph of Romano's original mirror installation preserved from Knockout Dropper before the bomber was scrapped in 1946. There was also a letter from the museum director explaining that they were creating a new exhibit on innovations born from necessity and wanted to feature the Romano Reflector System. Would the family be willing to loan any materials for display? Sarah sent them the original sketch, the one with grease stains and pencil lines showing 3 mirrors at precise angles. She sent them David Williams' letter. She sent them the 4-page excerpt from the Air Force history. And she sent them a photograph of Romano at age 22 in his flight suit, standing beside Knockout Dropper with his crew. He looked impossibly young in the photo, thin and serious, and trying hard not to be scared. The exhibit opened in 2004. Thousands of people walked past the display case showing 3 small mirrors and a greasy sketch and a photograph of a crew that had survived. Most people spent maybe 30 seconds looking at it before moving on to more dramatic exhibits, fighter planes and missiles and space capsules. But some people stopped and read the whole story. Some people understood what it meant that an uneducated steelworker had changed aerial warfare with materials stolen from a salvage yard. And some people, veterans, mostly men who'd lived through their own desperate innovations in their own impossible situations, stood in front of that display case for a long time. They didn't need the placard to explain why this mattered. They understood that sometimes the only way to survive was to fix the broken thing yourself. They understood that bureaucracy moved slowly and death moved fast. They understood that the distance between a good idea and approved implementation was measured in corpses. In 2018, the Air Force published a revised history of World War II tactical innovations. The Romano Reflector System received an entire chapter. Researchers had tracked down maintenance logs, mission reports, and statistical analyses showing exactly how much the mirrors had changed aerial combat. The numbers were even more impressive than the original estimates. Over 3,000 B-17s had been equipped with the system by the end of the war. Tail gunner effectiveness had increased by 340%. Rear attack losses had decreased by 38% across the entire theater. The chapter concluded. Sergeant Michael Romano's innovation represents a paradigm case of battlefield adaptation, the ability of frontline personnel to identify and solve tactical problems faster than institutional processes can respond. His willingness to circumvent regulations in service of a greater good raises important questions about the balance between order and initiative in military organizations. How many lives could have been saved if his solution had been implemented 6 months earlier? How many other innovations were suppressed because their inventors lacked Romano's courage to bypass the system? These questions remain relevant for contemporary military operations. By then, everyone directly involved was dead. Romano, Kellerman, Pierce, Ray, all gone. The men who'd flown with the mirrors, who'd survived because of them, who'd gone home and had children and grandchildren, most of them were gone too. But the mirrors remained in museums and history books and engineering case studies. The innovation persisted even after its creators had faded. That's how memory functions in institutions. The men disappear, but their work remains crystallized in technical specifications and historical analysis. Romano became an example, a case study, a lesson about innovation and courage, and the necessity of sometimes breaking rules to save lives. He would have hated the attention, but he would have understood why it mattered. Because the story wasn't really about mirrors or gun sights or tactical innovations. It was about refusing to accept that the system was immutable. It was about one person looking at a problem that killed men daily and saying, "This can be fixed." It was about having the courage to act without permission when permission would never come. And it was about the strange mathematics of how small acts of defiance can cascade forward through time in ways their originators never witness. Romano saved 8,400 lives directly, but those 8,400 men had children. Those children had children. By 2025, his innovation had preserved maybe 50,000 lives that wouldn't have existed otherwise. 50,000 people who went to work and fell in love and raised families and never knew they owed their existence to a scared tail gunner who'd refused to die quietly. That's the legacy, not the commendations or the museum exhibits or the historical analyses. Just the quiet accumulation of lives lived that would have been lives lost. Just the persistence of human ingenuity in the face of institutional inertia. Just the proof that sometimes one person really can change everything. They built the system to be immutable, but it was changed by the courage to question it. They designed the gun sights to be adequate, but they were improved by men who refused adequacy. They expected tail gunners to die quietly following procedures, but some tail gunners chose innovation over obedience. And in that choice, in that moment of desperate creativity, something shifted. The machinery of death met the machinery of human problem-solving, and for once, the humans won. If you believe that names like Romano Kellerman and Pierce deserve to be remembered, men who risked everything to fix what everyone else accepted as broken, then share this story. Write their names in the comments. Because memory is resistance. Because the distance between impossible and done is often just one person refusing to accept the difference. Because 8,400 lives is not an abstraction. It's 8,400 futures that almost didn't happen. And it all started with 3 pieces of glass and one man who couldn't hit anything but refused to stop trying.